everybody. It's me. Thanks for being here today. My name's Bryn Durgan, and I'm the Director of Programming here at Bookstore One. And of course, we're an independent bookstore, but we also have tons of events like these. We have book clubs, again, author talks, and actually, we have had a writing workshop up here for the last week. Today's day 3 with the author of The Hour. So I will now introduce you to her, tell you a little bit about her. She is the author of the New York Times bestselling memoir, Perfection, and Eva and Eve. She's written for publications including the New York Times, Salon, Dame, Tablet, Catapult, Glamour, and the list goes on. Her essay, Instruction, appeared in the anthology The Moment, edited by Larry Smith, creator of 6-word memoirs. She posts essays on life and writing on the weekly Substack, Consider the Spider. She's been a guest on podcasts including Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books, Dear Sugar Radio, co-hosted by Cheryl Strayed and Steve Almond, Women of the Hour, BBC's radio show The Y Factor on the subject of truth, and U-Turns. She is a fellow of the Yaddo Corporation, the McDowell Colony, and the Virginia Center for Creative Arts. She is also the winner of a literary death match, the International Competitive Reading Series, and she lives with her family and cats in the Hudson River Valley. And of course, I'm talking about the wonderful Julie Metz, so let's give her a round of applause.
So thanks so much for being here.
You're Mike, Julie.
Oh, Mike. Right. Sorry about that. I've been not Mike this week. Can everyone hear? Yeah. Okay, good. Sorry about that. Yes, thank you so much to Bookstore One for having me. It has been a wonderful week. I've had a great time teaching up here. We have 14 lovely students who've been very energized to write. And now I'm here to talk about Eva and Eve. Eva, the title, Eva was my mother. She was born in Vienna in 1928. And when she came to the United States and became an American citizen, she changed her name to Eve. And so to me, that was sort of her before and her after, that she began a life in Europe and then came to America and did her best to become an American. So we'll start with the first slide. So you'll have a brief introduction to the very beautiful world of Vienna before the Second World War. So this book began when, after my mother died in 2006, I was going through her drawers, and in the way back of a drawer that we were never allowed to go into because it had, nightgowns and things that we weren't supposed to mess with, we kids, I found this book, and no one had ever seen it before, not my father. In 54 years of marriage, we had no idea what it was. What it is they're called poesy albums in German. They were autograph books that children kept, specifically a lot of the Jewish children who knew that they were going to be leaving, or at any rate that their families were going to try to leave. And in this book were poems, letters of farewell from her friends and school children friends, and also from some teachers that taught her at school. And it was just very kind of heartbreaking to realize she'd kept all this in a drawer and had never shared it with anyone in the family at all. Oh, please come if you're anyway, thanks. We just started. So after I found this book, I wanted to find out more, and I began researching. My mother had never kept a diary, and she never really talked very much about the war. The stories she shared were very limited and always the same ones. And so I realized I was going to have to, do research and go on an adventure of my own to find out what had really happened. So we'll have a look at the next one. So the city of Vienna there's a long history of Jewish culture in Vienna. It actually dates back to the Roman Empire, believe it or not, but we won't go back that far. But for the purposes of this book, the world of Vienna right before the Second World War was one in which Jews, there was a level of acceptance, and they were very much part of the culture. So writers, artists, musicians, that, you know, countless people had migrated to Vienna from outer areas, including an area that was called Galicia. It doesn't exist anymore, but would be sort of Ukraine and Poland, kind of an area that straddles that area. And they came to Vienna looking for work, just like so many people do when they're migrating to cities. Then what happened in Vienna was really an amazing flowering of culture that started after the First World War. And this was really when Austria was created. It was created after the First World War from the leftovers of the Versailles Treaty. If you know anything about how the Austria-Hungarian Empire was enormous and vast, it was all chopped up after the First World War, and what was left became the Austrian Republic. In that city of Vienna, you had this amazing cafe culture. This was where people gathered. Writers gathered, musicians, poets, everybody doing amazing, wonderful things, including Stefan Zweig, this author who, if you have not read his stories, they're really very beautiful and capture this world very beautifully. We'll look at the next one. Here's another photo of this would be most likely from, more like the 20s, but it was really just a very vibrant culture. One of the things that was interesting was that in the aftermath of the war, in this new Republic of Austria, it was the Jewish population that was, they were really the most enthusiastic Austrians. Many of the other people kind of resented the collapse of the empire. Many of them were frankly longing to restore this empire. And this, of course, began the seeds of the rise of fascism in the late 20s, and then, of course, in the 1930s. So there was this conflict, and for many, there was anti-Semitism, but you could live your life. And in fact, my grandparents, whose names were Julius and Anna, had a very nice upper middle class life. My grandfather ran a printing factory that produced paper goods for the pharmaceutical industry. Doesn't sound very glamorous, but my mother, the one story she would always tell us was that there was something that they made at this factory that had saved his life and therefore saved the family, and I will be showing that to you. So we'll look at the next one. That's okay. So the company, this is an actual invoice that I found at a Croatian pharmacology museum, which is amazing that it exists. And the company was called Adolf Eisenman and Son. It's unclear if there even was a son. It may have been sort of, the way people do. That building there on the left is the building where my mother grew up. I've visited that building several times. The factory building that you see behind with the smokestacks is absolutely an exaggeration. It's not that tall, there are no smokestacks. But, it was advertising. So, in fact, this pencil writing might even be my grandfather's handwriting, it's possible. But anyway, this was for a pharmacy that was in Zagreb. So at this point, this company was quite successful. They were selling paper goods, at that time, medicine was still powdered, and it was presented to the patient in paper wrappers. So there were no pills yet, or they weren't really very common. So they were sending their paper goods all the way to Zagreb, to Switzerland, all different countries. So my grandmother had been my grandfather's secretary, and that was how they met and married. And then they married and moved into an apartment in this very building. The factory, by the way, the building still exists. I have been inside it, and so we'll look at the next one. So this is my very beautiful grandmother, probably in 1920 or so. One of the things that was in Vienna of this time, in the pre-war time, people had a wonderful time. They went to all kinds of balls, including these costume balls. So I think maybe she's Flora of the Spring, I'm not quite sure. But those are real flowers. I've looked at it under a loop, and it's and she pretty much made it. I'm sure she made that herself. Then she also appears in the lower right, second from the right, dressed, I think, as Mozart, but I'm not sure. So those are her brothers. So everyone was out and about. They were participating in the culture. If you were Jewish in this city, you had a life. You really felt that you were accepted, and you could pursue your talents, and people did. So we'll look at the next one. So this is the item that I was referring to, the paper. So sort of, my mother would always describe it as a paper fan. So I hope you can see it's sort of like an origami, I guess, little pieces of folded paper. They were glued together, and then inside the capsule went the powdered medicine. And then each, how many doses you needed, those were pulled off and folded and presented to the patient. And this is the way medicine was sold until pills came into common use. Well, then at the time of the war, when the war started, metal was being rationed. And since pills were sold in metal containers, then suddenly this very humble paper object became very important. And this is where it turned into this very small item that saved my grandfather from deportation. And this is my artistic photograph of the item. It is still being manufactured to this day. I've seen the factory, and the book presents the story of discovering this amazing machine that I saw the machine. I'm pretty sure it is the same machine. It looks very ancient and very tinkered with, like someone had really made so many of the pieces by hand. It was really one of the most amazing things I've ever seen. But so they make this paper good still. It's used for homeopathic medicine, and they sell it in Europe. Wow. So I ordered myself a box, and I have them at home. So, yes. Oh, did someone have a question?
No.
Oh, yeah, anyway. So this is what it looks like close up. And the item was referred to as a Pulverkapseln, and forgive my German. So what happened was, and the book of course describes the story, is that like many owners of businesses, Jewish owners of businesses, when the Nazis arrived in 1938, in March, they stole all the businesses that were owned by Jews, took away property, and many of those people were then deported and sent to, they weren't called concentration camps then, but in this case, Dachau, which was near Munich. They called it a work camp at that time. My grandfather was arrested in the fall of 1938, and he was held, we believe, at a police station in Vienna, and for some days. And then his workers, who were many of them were not Jewish, did a very kind and generous thing and protested that they couldn't run the factory without him, that they didn't know how to operate the machine, this contraption that I saw. At the time when my mother would tell me the story, I thought, how hard could this machine be? I mean, it's a printing machine. But then when I saw it, I thought, oh, I think I understand. So indeed, it's a one-off. I've never seen anything else like it. So we'll look at the next one. At any rate, then what happened was that he was returned to the factory. Even though he didn't own it anymore, he was told to continue operating the factory. Another thing, of course, Vienna is near the Alps, and everybody in Austria were They were crazy for mountain climbing, including my grandfather. That's him there with the rucksack standing on the ladder. Very fortunately, this photo was dated. It helped me a lot so that I could place him and determine his age. He was 53. I don't think I would have attempted that at any age. But anyway, that's his best friend, who ran a art gallery, and I think that's his daughter. That would have been his best friend's daughter. This Austrian mountain climbing club was founded in the early 20s after the main Austrian climbing club rejected all the Jewish members. So in other words, there was anti-Semitism, but the solution then was, okay, well, they're kicking us out, but we'll just make our own mountain climbing club. One of the famous members was Viktor Frankl. You may have heard of the book, Man's Search for Meaning. So he was an Auschwitz survivor who lost his family during the war and then became a psychiatrist and famous author. For me, this is a very important thing. This was the membership card in the Austrian Jewish Mountain Climbing Club, and you'll see the date is 1938. So they had renewed their card in January of 1938 because to them, life was going on. You know, there were bad things were happening in Germany. By this point, Hitler had been chancellor then and in Germany since 1933. But life in Austria was still good, and there was no reason for people to be terrified, so they thought. So that's my grandmother on the, they both had a membership. And then here's some photographs just of the family, and you can see that they had a very comfortable, they were comfortably upper middle class. My grandparents with my oldest uncle, that's my mother, maybe she's 2 or 3 in that photograph with an uncle. And then on the far side are the 3 children, the 3 Singer children. My mother's in the middle, and I think you can see from her arm position that she was pretty tough. She had 2 older brothers and very determined personality, and I see my mother there, so. And then this photograph was dated on the back side, January 1938. So it seems to be, it was taken at probably in their apartment. She's wearing this kind of Austrian dress, you know, and people were very Austrian, you know, they were very, the Jews of Austria very much identified as Austrians. That was their first way that they would have identified. They were a fairly, I mean, they were more religious than the way I was raised, but, you know, kind of secular-ish, I guess you might say, and that they were more identified with their country than their faith. Of course, this looks like a very happy and cared-for child, and then 2 months later, everything changed. And we'll look at the next one. And this is the arrival of Hitler in Vienna. For many, many decades after the war, the Austrians claimed that they had been invaded and that they were not responsible for what happened. There is just this photo and countless films and endless photographs show that this was an absolute lie. And in fact, the Austrians, I had mentioned that many people were sort of longing for this restoration of the empire. It was those people who welcomed Hitler. They lined the streets. Women were weeping, throwing their handkerchiefs. It was really completely a different narrative that the Austrian government then tried to hide for many decades to avoid paying restitution. And of course, immediately, the lives of Jews in Austria changed. They were no longer citizens and they lost all civil rights, and they knew they had to leave, but then the problem was how to get out, because the person who had been installed, Adolf Eichmann, that was really interested in stripping them of their possessions and property, and then evicting them, basically to get rid of them. At that time, this was before the so-called final solution that was initiated in 1942. So at this time, it was just take away everything they have and throw them out and get rid of them. The problem was that other countries didn't want them either. So you had a population desperate to leave, and no one would take them, including the United States, because we had extremely restrictive immigration policies. So we'll go to the next one. Now, this is a strange story that is more detailed in the book. This is a man named Jakob Ehrlich. He was a very high-placed person in the Jewish community. There was a Jewish community center in the Jewish quarter of Vienna, and he was among the most important people in that community center. As it happened, by a strange coincidence, he lived in my mother's apartment building, so he was an upstairs neighbor. What happened was that as soon as the Nazis arrived, they gathered up these so-called celebrity Jews, including Jakob Ehrlich, and sent them to Dachau. Jakob Ehrlich did not survive. He was dead within a month. His wife and child then fled to London. So at this point, you can imagine that my grandparents living in this very same building and their upstairs neighbor disappears, they knew they had to leave. So at that point, everything was focused on trying to leave. They sent my two uncles to London, where they had relatives, and then this was always a question that I had. My mother refused to go. She insisted on staying behind. And, I thought a lot about that because, she was 9.5 at the time. But I think you can see from that previous photograph of a very determined girl with her arms crossed that she just said no, she wasn't going, she was going to stay with her parents. And that is what she did. So we'll go to the next one. So after this, of course, it was my mother and her parents were kind of trapped in their apartment for 2 years. And much of my research was about how did people survive? Like, how did you eat? Where they had no more money, and you could sell off your furniture and your possessions, but you had to eat. How this happened, of course, in all the cases of people who survived this time, there were always some good people, and in this case, those good people were the caretakers of the building. So you'll read about it, but there were people there was a caretaker and his wife who seemed to have kind of provided food for them and made sure that they were protected. Part of this is because that caretaker, his other job was the foreman of my grandfather's factory. So he had been, my grandfather had been good to him and he returned the favor. So you read a lot of stories about how people got out of places in Germany and all around in Europe. And there was always somebody, who helped them because it was impossible otherwise. And then came, you may have heard it's called Kristallnacht on November 8th to 9th. It was a pogrom that was in Vienna and also in other countries. And what happened then was that all the synagogues in Vienna were destroyed or vandalized, and all the businesses that were owned by Jews that were very visible. This included the synagogue that was in my mother's neighborhood. The one synagogue that survived, and if you ever do go to Vienna, you can go see it, is tucked on a side street. And the reason why it was spared was that on the reverse side of it, it's sort of hard to explain, but on the back side of the synagogue was the Jewish Community Center. And what the Jewish Community Center held were all the birth records, marriage records, and obviously addresses of every Jew in Vienna. And the Nazis did not want that destroyed. They wanted to keep that because that was how they were going to round up all the Jews of Vienna. So they preserved that one synagogue, and it is a very beautiful place, and you can visit it if you ever do go. This is one spread that I find very haunting from the inside of that poesy album that I showed you at the very beginning. It's written by a little classroom friend named Renata. At the bottom, she signs it, and you can see that it's drawings from The Three Little Pigs, the Disney film, which had aired in Vienna in 1939. And by that point, everybody understood who the big bad wolf was. So it was definitely Eichmann, and everyone understood the meaning of that. Basically, she's saying goodbye to her friend, and that was dated January in 1939. So now almost a year has passed since the Nazis arrived. The problem was that my grandfather, having been taken down to that police station, but then sent back to run this factory, he could not get his passport back in order to leave. The bureaucracy was just kind of horrifying, a real catch-22 situation. So they were struggling first just to get the passport, and then maybe they would have to get a visa to somewhere. Many people at this point, they would go to Argentina. A lot of people went to Shanghai, actually, huge Jewish community in Shanghai. They lived in encampments for the entirety of the war. There was actually a remarkable piece about it in the New York Times a few years ago. But you had to go somewhere, and of course to get to the United States where they had relatives, they would have needed a visa. Very hard to get the visa. By this point also, war had been declared, so they couldn't go to England where their two boys were. So the boys were in England with relatives, and they were going to have to find some other place. I know at one point they considered Argentina because they had a relative there. We'll go to the next one. Finally, they did get their passports, and my mother saved them, for which I'm very grateful, because it was almost like everything was dated, and I was able to track their progress as they left and resettled because of the dates stamped in the passport. So my mother's listed on the far right as their dependent. So always when I was a kid, these were in my mother's jewelry drawer, and sometimes I would peek in there and look at them, but they sort of exuded this force field. You just almost didn't even want to touch them. But I'm very happy that she saved them.
I can't see. Does it say Jew anywhere there?
That's on a different page. It had a red stamp. Yeah, this is the page that had just their photos, but on the following page there was a red J. So. But you can see anyway, so then when I found those passports and I was now doing research, I had, of course, always seen the visa at the way back of the American visa. And now I became curious about who it was, this mysterious person who had given them their visa. And his name was Donald Winchester Brown III. If you've ever heard of the Brown Harris Stevens Realty Company, it is those Browns. So he was the son of a very wealthy family from New York, the Brown family. He went to Harvard, very well educated, but before he went to Harvard, he had been sent to a boarding school in Switzerland where he developed a great devotion to mountain climbing. And when I found that out, I felt like really some door opened to this narrative, because of course, how did people get these visas? It's the same way people get anything now, it's someone you know. So you got these appointments at the consulate to get your visa through a friend, or someone put in a good word for you. And so I had this very strong sense that this man who had moved to Austria, he was very young, he was 29 years old, but indeed was a very avid climber, that he would have had some compassion for this family that needed to get out, that also had a mountain climber, and even though at this point my grandfather was much too weakened and ill after these experiences to climb again. And finally they got their visa, and you'll read about, I was able to locate a descendant of the Brown family, and I was able to get those photographs from the family itself. And that was quite something. Then the way people could still get out is once you had your visa, you went to Trieste. And the story of Trieste is really quite fascinating. There was a very large Jewish community in Trieste because Trieste had once been part of the Austria-Hungarian Empire. It was their warm water port, very valuable to them. So I went to Trieste, met with people there in the Jewish community. Very tragically, that whole Jewish community that had supported so many people who were emigrating, hundreds of thousands of people, starting in the 1920s, passed through the city of Trieste. But then after the Italians surrendered in 1943, the Germans swooped in, took over Trieste, and deported, sadly, the most of that Jewish population. But this is the ship that they sailed on. It was called the Saturnia, and I was able to locate the captain's log for their particular journey, which was in April of 1940. And this was wartime, so they were crossing the Atlantic, German submarines. It was a very terrifying crossing. It wasn't a tourist trip. There was a first class, but yeah, it was quite something. I was very grateful to all the archives and museums in Trieste, the Maritime Museum there, that helped me locate this handwritten log. But they sent me photocopies, but it's one of my treasured possessions. When they left, over there is the tag that was on a trunk that was still in my parents' closet for years and years. I didn't know what it was, this trunk. And that was the tag that was on it, probably my grandfather's writing. These are some of the very few objects that they brought with them. Those are my grandfather's camping tools, his utensils. I love them. They fold. They're very wonderful. Wow. And his compass that he took with him. And then a few other items, some beautiful costume jewelry from the 1920s that was my grandmother's. But they didn't bring much, 2 trunks, and I think they were able to ship ahead a few pieces of furniture, because there were some mysterious pieces of furniture that have been in the family that don't have a ready explanation, but not much. They didn't bring much. And then they arrived in New York. They hardly spoke English. This is how they looked when they first arrived, like Europeans, right off the boat. And I love this photograph. It was taken at the Ford Pavilion at the World's Fair in 1939. And really, it's kind of amazing to see this kind of American icon of, capitalism and modernity, and these 3 people who really had been through a lot. So my mother then would have been about 12 and a half, 13. But then she became this young woman very quickly. So that's my mother about 16 or 17, looking very American and very glamorous. And then meanwhile, my father, in the middle there, had served in the American Army in the Battle of the Bulge. He served in a mortar battalion, and he's probably about 19 there in that photograph. I don't even know how that photograph happened. I have no idea, but we have it, and it's good. And then they met on a blind date in 1947, arranged by friends, and taken by he became a professional photographer. It was the friend who took that photograph. And you can see my mom had sort of a quirky style of her own, and kind of a fun sense of humor, the way she's posed. Anyway, they met and they married in 1949, so they were together, all those years, and my father never saw that poesy album that was in the beginning. She never showed it to him. And then, kind of a full circle is they both ended up at the publishing company Simon & Schuster, large publishing company in New York. This is probably from the 60s, sometime in the 1960s. They spent most of their careers at that company, and in the end, it's kind of interesting because she ended up back in the paper and ink business just like her father, and I suppose I have done the same. So so this is, I guess we're just paper and ink people. And that is where we will leave it. And then if you have any questions, I would love to answer them. And yeah.
I have a question.
Yes.
So when did the seed for this memoir really start for you, and how long was the process from beginning to end?
So it started, shortly after my mother died is when I found that book. At the time, I was actually finishing my first book. So I kind of sat with everything for a while, and but I would say shortly after that is when I first started poking around, but I wasn't a historian, and a lot of this was very intensive research, so I needed to find partners. And so one of the things that a lot of people are always very curious how they can research their own family history, and what I can say is that there'll always be somebody who will help you, because I started from zero with very little research experience like this, and in my case, my mother had given an interview to an institute called the Leo Baeck Institute. It's in New York City, that studies German-speaking Jewish history, and one of the archivists there just kind of took my hand and showed me how to do it, and told me who to call and who to write to. And then when I went to Vienna on 2 different research trips, he kind of arranged contacts for me. So it took, to answer your question, I'm gonna say 10 years, all in, yeah. But I was doing other things, raising a child, I had a job, yeah, things like that. So, so there'd be spurts of it, where I'd go on a trip, I'd come back, more research. I think a lot of people have this kind of story with a family history.
Yeah. One more follow-up question to that. It must have been, I imagine, complicated doing all this research, learning so much about your mother, kind of like immediately after she passed, right?
Yeah.
So did that help with the grief? Did it complicate it? I wonder what your experience was there.
Yeah, that's interesting. My mother and I actually had a difficult relationship. She was, I think the experience of being forcibly exiled from the country that she had loved left her very embittered, and she had a kind of a glass half empty, or less than half, and kind of approach to life. So we were often in conflict, but what happened, I think, in doing this research is that I began to understand all of how this had come to pass. And I'm not a very woo-woo person at all, but I did often feel that she'd left things behind for me to find and to do something with it, and that I was, kind of being guided in a way. So, yeah, thanks.
So she didn't share much of her
Very little.
background.
I knew when I was a college student, I had been to, I was traveling around in Europe, and I wanted to go to Vienna, and I wanted to see her house. And I asked her for the address, but she had never been back. She'd been to Vienna, but never been back to her house.
But she had the address.
Yes, but she had the address, and so I went there, And she seemed really happy that I had gone, and she gave me a list of all the cafes that I should go to and the restaurants, and we went to the opera and everything. So she missed it really quite desperately, I would say, yeah.
So this parallels my own experience with my father, who was an immigrant, born in Kiev in 1899, and immigrated in about 1913. About 1913. I knew that he had a twin brother, not an identical twin brother. He grew up with through, age 10 at least. We didn't know his name, never spoke about him, never described anything.
My mother hardly talked about it at
background.
all. Yeah.
In 1967, I was transiting the long way from Tokyo all the way back to Boston via the Soviet Union, and chose to go to Kiev, and wrote to him. He remembered his address, which had changed because they changed all the addresses in Kiev, but they had a book.
There's a book in Vienna where you can look up old addresses, and then even if the number has changed, you can find it.
I was able to find his house, which was still standing remarkably after all the war damage to Kiev and the destruction of the whole Jewish community in the neighborhood where he lived at Babi Yar.
Oh yeah, of course, in Babi Yar. I mean, one thing that I didn't know when I was doing the research is that Vienna was heavily bombed at the end of the war. If you go there now, you can hardly see the evidence of it, but my father told me that when he and my mother made their very first trip back to Vienna in 1956, so she hadn't been home, well, what she still thought of as home, in 16 years. And at that point, the famous Vienna Opera House was still being rebuilt. So, it had been, I think half of it was just bombed to nothing. So you never would see that now. But if you, her neighborhood was largely spared. I think the areas that were most bombed were in the center. If you've ever seen the movie The Third Man, it was filmed on location right after the war in Vienna, and you are looking at, it's not a set. I mean, you're looking at the actual bombed Vienna.
You deal with that psychology of repressed disclosure.
Yeah, well, that's a lot of a lot of the work that I did was trying to really first excavate the story itself, and then wrestle really with just the ordeal of all immigrants, who do not leave voluntarily, who, they leave because they have to, not because they want to. And it's, at that time, you came as a child, there were no inclusion classes, there was no attempt to integrate children who were coming, who didn't speak English. My mother didn't speak English. They just threw you into public school and you just had to learn. There was a huge, by the way, community in New York City of German and Austrian refugees. And some people just, they just hated it. They just wanted to go home. And some people did after the war. But, my grandparents, they were very sturdy people. One of the most curious parts of this story is they ended up opening up a restaurant, an Austrian restaurant, and I was actually able to trace the origins of this restaurant back to Vienna. There had been another one there. Yeah, crazy, yeah, yes.
Do you have any connections to your uncles?
So, at this time, one of the uncles never left England. He stayed in London for the remainder of his life. The middle child, whose name was Adolf, amazingly, we didn't call him that, but we called him Dolphy. But anyway, he was a physician, and he came to the United States in 1961. So I have cousins, and I'm close to them. There are English cousins whom I don't see so often, but we're connected. But the one who was in England, he never left. He just settled in. Now they're all have passed, so the three children are all gone at this point. But we still have the community of our cousins. So yes.
My great-grandparents are from Vienna.
Mm.
And I remember my great-grandmother always saying, I'm Austrian.
Mm-hmm.
Jewish background.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just wondering, have you tried to get a passport from
I
Austria?
have, and I have one. Yeah, it took 2 years.
Isn't it interesting though?
It was, I'm very happy that I have it. So it was a long process. The Austrian government finally having accepted responsibility for its role in the Holocaust changed its citizenship law in 2020.
Wow.
And at that point we could then apply. And when I talked to groups of Austrian descendants, if you're interested at all, there's a Facebook page. I could get you the information for how to do it. It takes time. It'll take about 2 years, but you'll get it. Yeah. And then you're an EU citizen, so I'm a dual citizen. So you don't have to give up your American citizenship. I'm now a dual citizen. And it feels right,
Yeah.
It feels like, there's a part of me that is very attached to Europe, and when I'm there, I feel very much at home. So I've been to Vienna now 3 times, and when I go there now,
It's a beautiful city.
yeah, it's beautiful and strangely very progressive. The city of Vienna is very progressive. The country, not so much, but yeah, especially not right now. But it is an amazing city, and when I go there, there's only, I think at this point, about 10,000 Jews in Vienna. Before the war, there were 200,000. So just to give you an idea. And the Jews who are there now, they're not really descendants of people like my grandparents. They're from Russia. So also fleeing, they're leaving. They go to Vienna for a different life. So, which is what Vienna always was for the Jewish community. Yeah.
So before we do the signing, Julie, of course, has another book here. Can you tell us a little bit, just a little bit about Perfection?
Yes, I can. So my first book is called Perfection, and it is about myself, about I guess we could say, the dissolution of a marriage, my first marriage, that happened very suddenly as a small town scandal of shocking proportions. Then it's I'm told
That's
it's
a
a
great
page
teaser.
turner.
Yeah.
I'm told it's a page turner. Yeah. So.
And we have it right downstairs
And we
too.
have it downstairs, and I'll be happy to sign. And I do also have some postcards for Eva and Eve. If anyone would like a few, they're just to give around. If you have any friends who might be interested as well.
And we have more copies downstairs.
Yeah.
But yeah, we'll give a round of applause. Thank you so much for being here. If you haven't gotten your books yet, right downstairs, and then